All right, I want to show a little bit of a gotcha that can happen when testing views, and specifically the view data that's passed into a view. So here's a very simple action that is just returning the view with the status field. And I'm using an enum. It can be either active or inactive. So in our test, we could do something like this, where we're asserting the view is welcome, but we want to go a step further. We want to say assert view has status. All right, so this is pretty straightforward. If I run that, it passes. To me, this is still a very weak test. I want to say not just that there is a status, but like, what is the status? Because there's likely some logic behind it, whether it's active or inactive. So I could say status active. And now I've tightened that test up a little bit. All right, so far so good. Let's try something here. What if, in this case, the value could also be null? Now, obviously, if I change that to null and I run this test, it's going to fail. So what we would logically do then is like this, right? Okay, I run that test, it passes. This is where the gotcha comes in. This is not doing what you think it's doing. And I'm going to demonstrate that. If I go back and I change this now to status active, if this is doing what we think it's doing, this should fail, right? It passes. Why is that happening? Well, if we dig into this assert view has, we can see that the default value, that parameter, is null. And if we go down further, the very first check, it says, hey, if the value is null, all I want you to assert is whether the key is present or not. And so this is how that first version of the test works, where we only present the key. It's saying, hey, if you just give me the key and no value, I'm only going to test that the key is present. And because null is the way it's signaling that, that's where we get into trouble. And PHP Storm is kind of trying to help me. Notice how null is grayed out. It's because it's a redundant argument. So how can we actually have this test what we want it to test? We can do something like this. We can use a closure. So I can say status equals null. And now this test should fail. And if I expand this to see the error, or I guess I can hover over it, failed asserting that false is true. Not the most helpful error message because I'm using the closure here, but it does what we want. It's failing when it's not null. And now if I change it to null and I rerun the test, it's passing. So that's the way to do it. The one extra little bonus tip I'll give you on top of this is this can get kind of tedious to have to always use this closure. So what I've done is in my app service provider, you can actually create a macro on the test response. And I just give it a name like this, assert view has, because that follows the naming convention, but assert view has null. And now, and inside it's doing what I just did in my test. But now I could refactor this to just say that. This test will still pass. And now if I bounce back here and I change this to something else, rerun it, my test fails. So that's what I would do. I tend to do this enough that it's worth having that macro in there. And just as a little aside, if you're like, hey, why does that have squiggles? Well, let me go back to when it was passing. I just want to point this out. It's not a main point, but interesting all the same. This is just because that macro isn't part of the class. So you could use something like IDE helper, or you could generate like a stub file or something so that your editor knows that that macro method exists. That's just a minor thing. But the main point to take away from this is if you're asserting that a view data value is null, it is not doing what you think, and you're really going to want to tighten up your test.